So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today at the CURE seminar. Today we have Mette Hotker, who is a lecturer here at RMIT across the sustainability and urban planning programs. And today she will be presenting her work on gambling with the city. I will ask you, I can see you're all mute, so that's great. And we'll follow the same format as every other session, where you can post your questions on the chat function and also raise your hand and ask questions at the end of the session for the Q&A. So over to you, Mette, when you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to start to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I work and the universities, and pay my respect to the elders past and present and emerging, and also make a little note that the Kulin Nations Bundjil law is at the forefront when I present here. Namely in the name of acting and behaving with care and ethics. So thank you for the opportunity to share my research interest in this semester, in this seminar. And in the next 20 minutes, I will intend to argue poker machines need the attention of planning. And I'll support that argument by sharing some of my research findings relating to Victoria's poker machine regulation. And in doing so, I will also briefly demonstrate how decision tree can be used unconventionally to evaluate policy, but also as an approach to identify current knowledge gaps, potentially sort of identifying further research. So starting with this figure, in excess of $45 billion. That's how much Victorians have lost on poker machines since 2002. Australians love playing the pokies, but poker machines are also controversial spatial fixtures in our cities. And right now, as we speak, controversy are bursting in the media. The Victorian gambling regulator has just approved a gambling venue of 70 machines in Truganina, one of Melbourne's urban growth zones west of the CBD, for those of you who are not familiar with Melbourne. And it's causing quite a stir. The metropolitan local government area of Brimbank is currently tearing their hair out because they have a record loss on pokies on a daily basis in the excess of $500,000. So as you can see on this slide, poker machine losses in Brimbank really are bigger now than they were before our lockdown last year. And interestingly, just as a point of interest really, gambling tend to increase during and after a crisis. And last time I looked, there, which was the 9th of May from memory, there was more than $7.5 million lost daily on poker machines in Victoria. Oh, sorry, so I will just move. So just briefly, why should we be worried about so many people having such fun engaging in a perfectly legitimate pastime, as is mostly the preamble on any public document when we talk about poker machines? So they are extremely harmful, they're easily accessible, which is linked to higher expenditure on gambling, but also gambling harm. They're concentrated to a lot higher degree in disadvantaged areas who experience, of course, disproportional levels of harm from them. So they are really quite a significant contributor to growing inequality in Australia through the perpetuating of the vicious circle of disadvantage. They are highly spatial, yet they feature almost nowhere in planning debates. But before we pick up on that, let's just take a look at a spatial map of poker machine density. So this is a very recent map. So here you can see the distribution in Melbourne and Melbourne's metropolitan area. The green marks are poker machine venues, and the red ones are just poker machine venues in Brimbank. I just wanted to highlight them because I mentioned it before. And as you see here, density of poker machines are more intense in the north and west, lower socioeconomic and open growth areas, and actually also further out towards the Dandenongs to the east. They're highly accessible. As you can see, they are hanging like a string of pearls of transport routes here. So poker machines are regulated by a parallel permit system, planning and gambling. Key acts are the Planning and Environment Act, or PEA, the Gambling Regulation Act, GRA, and Local Government Act as well. There's a few other acts, but we don't need to go into that. So the requirement for planning's involvement in poker machine regulation recognises that they are quite spatial and they are urban fixtures, and therefore there's a need for local communities to have some sort of say in the spatial distribution of these machines. Local planning authority and local council are the decision makers on planning permits, and there are normal third-party rights and appeal rights within the planning system. They apply here as well. But problematically, the Planning and Environment Act has been quite ineffective, in my opinion, in assessing social and economic effects of development such as poker machines. And the way the Planning and Environment Act is practiced, provided land use requirements are met, not much can be done to scrutinise these developments. Now, the Gambling Regulation Act is there because to ensure lawful conducting of gambling, as well as the facilitation of perceived social and economic benefits from gambling, but at the same time minimising gambling harm. So it is the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation, and I'll either refer to it as VCGLR or the Commission or regulator, that issues the gambling licence permit. And in matters of licensing, only the local council can object. No third-party right exists under the gambling scheme. So the gambling regulator must make decisions with a view to the position of the local council, as well as the social and economic impacts of these decisions. So decisions are made by weighing up economic and social benefits of poker machine gambling, and this is referred to as the net detriment test. And for the test to pass and an application to be granted, the regulator must deem the proposal to have no negative benefit effects on the community. So in other words, it's kind of a utilitarian approach to the regulation of poker machines. So given the and I'm going to be a bit blunt here, the inertia of the Planning and Environment Act in regards to considering social and economic effects of developments such as pokies, how the gambling regulator rules becomes really important factor in shaping the spatial distribution of these machines. And part of my thesis research looked at this aspect in more detail. So we actually coded the regulator's decision documents relating to all poker machine application made to the regulator between 2001 to 2014, and we currently actually charting trends from 15 to 2020, so we'll soon have nearly 2 decades of data. We wanted to explore how variables, for example, such as how and to what extent the local council objected, and the level of disadvantage using CIFA data, and how that related to whether the regulator granted or refused the application. And then this coded information was then entered into spreadsheets and exported into SPSS to perform classification and regression tree analysis, as well as basic statistics such as chi-square and cross-tabulation. So today I'll just show how I used data mining unconventionally by using what's called a maximal tree, and I'll talk a bit about that later, together with these other basic statistics to get an understanding of how gambling policy had manifested for more than a decade. And just a few words about classification and aggression tree, because I promised I would say something about that. So it's a data mining technique that models data in a hierarchy in a graphic format. And it does so through binary splitting of variables accordingly to closeness, if you like, to the target variable, but also simultaneously considering its position in relation to other variables. So the tree, as you'll see very soon, reveals a complex interplay of variables and patterns. And the tree is shaped by these variables and some stopping rules that you set parameters around when you set it up in SPSS. So what the tree then produces, or the card algorithm, if you like, is a maximal tree. It is the tree that represents all the idiosyncratic data of your whole data set. So all your data entries are represented in this tree. Normally, this data set or the maximal tree is only used as, data root to construct what's called a best fit tree. So a best fit tree is really pruning of a data set to find a tree that's useful for classification or prediction. And the maximal tree is far too idiosyncratic for that. But for the purpose of this study, we decided it was much more useful to use the maximal tree, as we were interested exactly in looking at how policy manifested over time. So we were precisely interested in these idiosyncratic patterns of this maximal tree. So if you like, we got the maximal tree out of the recycle bin and we recycled it, if you like, to become a descriptive method by which we could have an easy overview of policy manifestations over time. And that's what's a bit unconventional about using decision trees in this way. So I'm going to demonstrate now how we can use this decision tree, and I really would like to apologize because the tree really needs either a A3 format or a big projection screen. So instead I've highlighted aspects of the tree that we can focus on, and I'm happy to, if anyone wants to have a look at the whole tree, send them as a PDF document that you can enlarge. So let's have a look at this. So I'll demonstrate just using a few examples how the maximal tree can be useful and easy to use by walking through the tree with 3 key policy aims of gambling regulation in mind, which I've sort of highlighted up in the right-hand corner in red. Facilitation of gambling, harm minimization, local influence, and these 3 keeping them in mind, we will do a quick scan and see what jumps out at us. So we see instantly up at the top that overall 87% of all applications made to the gambling regulator over these 13 years were approved. And if we discount administrative decisions such as opening hours and only look at what's here named EGM, so electronic gaming machines, so applications relating to gaming machine numbers, we see it jumps up to 89%. Moving a bit further down, we see that 20% of applications that are associated with what is termed active counsel opposition gets refused. So that lifts or lowers the approval rate by a good 10%. Active counsel opposition is resource heavy. It involves, for example, submitting a comprehensive social impact assessment in opposition to the proposal, but also making staff available for cross-examination at hearings, which is something a lot of counsellors are not prepared to do. So in instances where counsel only object by submitting a letter or expressing objection or no submission at all, you can see to your right that it jumps to 94%. So this is a bit of an issue because the Gambling Regulation Act actually stipulates that the Commission must consider any council submission. What also springs to mind in relation to these key policy aims are over on your right-hand side here. You can see from a harm minimisation position is that 91% applications are for clubs in the most disadvantaged areas in situ metro areas are approved. And we can also see the big number of club applications in rural and regional areas. And from a harm minimisation, that's problematic. But also we can see there's probably a propensity to approve them and the path it takes down through the tree, a propensity for councils not to oppose them strongly because there is, the temptation of using them as social and economic infrastructure in both urban growth zones areas, but also in rural and regional areas. So in relation to that point, if we have a look right down on your left hand corner, there's an arrow. You see that assuming all these venues, because they involve 50 plus machines, are new venues, they usually are when there's so many machines, are all approved in city metro areas. And this also sends out a red flag, I think, to the possibility that these developments might be used as social infrastructure in urban growth areas, such as the case with Wyndham, I alerted to at the start of the presentation, the approval of the venue holding 70 poker machines in Truganina. And we know very little about this. So this also sends or puts out a question mark here that this would be interesting perhaps to do some further study in. To what extent are these substituted with what I would say solid or sustainable social and economic infrastructure in these areas. And then there's the last thing I want to highlight here at this tree, and that is that remember the variables organize themselves hierarchically in relation to approved or refused applications. So from a harm minimisation perspective, we would assume that any variables with CIFA would sit very high up close to the decisions. But that's not the fact here. They're coming very low in the tree. And that is interesting considering harm minimisation. So that also raises a red flag in regards to one of these key policy aims. So very quick scan of this maximal tree stratifies risks associated with this current policy. And it also really points to many areas that may warrant further investigation, such as the use of venues as community hubs in growth areas, the vulnerability of rural and regional areas, and so forth. Now let's just dive in, because CART doesn't really tell us anything about the strength in terms of statistical significance directly between two variables. So for that, chi-square was quite useful. So let's look at some of the results relating to harm minimisation and local influence, for example. So we see the relationship between regulatory decisions and council position was statistically significant. But that was not the case between regulatory decisions and disadvantage, as would have been expected from a harm minimisation perspective, as also the maximal tree showed. At least from a harm minimisation, we would have expected a significant association between decisions to refuse and high disadvantage. We also observe here that council's responses were associated with disadvantage levels. So let's just zoom in on that position of the local authority or local council, and let's explore in what way this association can be understood. And that's best by having a look at cross-tabulating the data. So as you see on this graph, the more resources council put into their submission, the less likely the regulator is to approve the application. Remember, exactly this data pattern actually was highlighted by the maximal tree. So in regards to this graph, particularly two concerns come to mind here. Firstly, the Gambling Regulation Act does stipulate any council submission must be considered, and these findings suggest that may not be the case. And secondly, it suggests that only well-resourced council, but well-resourced communities are afforded adequate protection. So when we look at these resources and these resource-intensive council submissions and compare them with the most and least disadvantaged quartiles by index of relative social disadvantage and index of education and occupation, we see how vulnerable the most disadvantaged areas are, because they depend completely on council position and resources for protection. Remember, communities cannot object under the Gambling Regulation Act. So what these two sort of last couple of graphs shared with you show is that the role of the local council is really paramount as gatekeeper against gambling harm. So considering the policy aims, are we there yet? Well, we can certainly see that decisions are highly biased towards approving AGMs. So in terms of facilitating gambling opportunities, that gets a tick. But whether there is a nuanced, a thorough assessment of the true implications of this is perhaps, there's certainly some question marks raised against that. We also see that local council objections only appear to be assiduously considered by the Commission, and council objections are socially stratified against the most disadvantaged in Victoria. So really, public policy and institutional processes afforded the most disadvantaged communities the least protection against poker machine exposure and harm. In terms of decision tree as a method, I think this tree has shown it can be quite useful. I know it's a quite brief sort of scan we did, and it can be done in much more detail, but it's user-friendly, and very quickly it can sort of stratify risk associated with current policy. It's also a method that could be used to identify other avenues for research, as well as, it can be transferable to many other contexts. And of course, just be a bit careful when we do use CART. It's highly sensitive to small changes in the data. So, it pays sort of to use it as an explorative tool, and then diving in with other approaches. And of course, using the maximal tree is a new sort of approach, and, be good to see other applications and compare it with that. So poker machines, can we say they are missed planning opportunity, or are they planning through neglect? Poker machines or EGMs are strongly connected to space. They're easily accessible, but they are highly predatory. Their success as a product in terms of revenues and usage is unique in their complete dependence on space for sale and consumption. The consequences of widespread poker machine distribution are therefore directly and uniquely related to the regulation of urban space. The dominant presence of poker machines, the role as social infrastructure and local benefactor, if you like, while at the same time being a cause of great social harm, places them as a complex urban phenomenon, I think, urgently needing the attention of planning. But planning has only featured vaguely in this context, mainly approaching them as amenities and largely abandoning any critical engagement with these kind of developments. And yes, this has also been partly due to lack of clear guidelines in the Victorian planning scheme to assist local councils in assessing these kind of things, but also because this is often dealt with in a very sort of narrow spatial term, the assessments. So Therefore, social and economic assessments have been palmed off, if you like, to the gambling regulator, where there's very little opportunity for any material local influence. So given the extensive harm we're actually experiencing, neither planning nor gambling regulation have succeeded in appropriately assessing these types of developments. Problematically, assessments are based on costing gambling against perceived benefits, an assessment that, to frankly put it crudely, asks how many happy gamblers does a suicide cost? That's crude reality of utilitarian planning for gambling. And a final provocation. So on that note, I would like to finish with this. It is a prevailing conviction that by getting better at costing gambling and thereby gambling harm, we will advance a stronger and more convincing argument for curtailing the proliferation of poker machines in Australian cities, and in turn then prompt a paradigm shift away from gambling policy based on utilitarianism and a market rationale. And my response to that is that improving costing only fine-tunes the cost, for example, of a suicide, a mental breakdown, a hungry child to the taxpayer. Little does it actually tell us about the harm and its extent. Planning these kinds of developments through numerical considerations and expressions is inappropriate. They're poor simulacra of social harm, I think. Through numerical expressions, the voice of the social harm and sorrow is, in my view, sanitized and often silenced by numbers. And that concludes my presentation.